It's a real pleasure to introduce our speaker. She's been an inspiring presence at Yale this year as the Franke Visiting Fellow here at the Whitney Humanities Center. Dr. Makumbi has a Ph.D. in creative writing from Lancaster University in the UK, and she's the multi-award-winning author of a collection of short stories and 2 novels, with a 3rd novel in the final stages of completion. We're going to be hearing about that this afternoon. When her prize-winning first novel, Kintu, hit the shelves in 2014, readers and literary critics were arrested by a remarkable new voice, witty, questioning, political, historical, and deeply interested in people's decisions and behaviours. Kintu weaves together the parallel stories of the fall of a family, the Kintu family, and the rise of modern Uganda. It's simultaneously current and historical, it's realist and mythological, and it stretches over many generations of a family living under an ancient curse. Like her later work, it's inspired by Ugandan oral traditions, and Dr. Makumbi's distinctive use of oral forms has inspired a whole new wave of African historical fiction in the last 10 years, especially by women writers. In awarding Dr. Makumbi one of the prestigious Windham-Campbell Fiction Prizes in 2018, the prize committee described how they were struck by the bold originality of her writing, which, quote, encompasses ancient wounds that disquiet the present. Her historical novels are about anything but the rise and fall of European empires in Africa. They are filled with multiple timelines, spaces, multiple characters, often well outside the constraints of clock time and the European realist literary tradition. As she said in an interview when Kintu was published, I hate it when African creativity is brought back to European forms, as if we are incapable of imagination or lack our own stories to inspire us. Dr. Makumbi's second novel, published in North America as A Girl is a Body of Water and in the UK as The First Woman, brings to life potent mythologies around women's bodies in the context of Idi Amin's regime in 1970s Uganda. This sparkling novel was described by the chair of the Jalak Prize, which it won in 2021, as filled with, quote, magnetic, tender, vindictive, generous, oh-so-human characters. In it, Dr. Makumbi pays meticulous attention to details, like the pleasure, for example, of squashing a bloated mosquito mid-air, or the process of an adolescent girl's realisation of the power and the risks posed by her body. Supernatural events are woven into the day-to-day lives of the main characters in this novel, and Dr. Makumbi writes with great care about her characters' thoughts and feelings. As with Kintu, indeed, each character in this novel is delivered to the reader with such tenderness and humour that you almost forget the imaginative scope of the story. Dr. Makumbi's writing crosses cultures, regions, mythologies and languages without losing a sense of African and Ugandan specificity. Unsurprisingly, you can find many academic articles on her work, including many by scholars in African universities. But above all, her work is for African readers, particularly women and girls, helping to inspire them to recreate oral histories and reinterpret mythologies in ways that will empower them. And there's a lovely scene at the end of A Girl is a Body of Water, where the brilliantly witty young heroine announces that her beloved man, quote, is not afraid of the vagina. How do you know? The old woman, Nsuta, asks. I showed him, she replies with hilarious simplicity. And then she adds in a message that reaches out of the book and it enfolds readers. It is dangerous keeping feminine power down there. Whether it is in myths or in mystery, we put a target on our bodies. Sooner or later, they come to raid. And Idi Amin's massacres are given as the example of these raids, connecting the control of women's bodies directly with national politics. Well, it's a real treat to be given a preview of Dr. Makumbi's new work, Alkebulan, When the Lions Returned, this evening, and it's a privilege to have you here, Dr. Makumbi. Let us welcome Jennifer Nansubuga Makumbi for this evening's lecture. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining me this evening, and I hope we're going to have a good time. Stephanie, that introduction was absolutely wonderful. Sometimes I don't recognize myself. Sometimes people talk about my books and I think, did I write that? But I would also like to thank the Whitney Humanities Center and Center for African Studies, Cajetan, Iheka, who are sponsoring this talk this afternoon. I would also like to thank members of the Whitney Centers who have put all of this together. Diane, this is just fantastic. Megan, Amy. These people have been wonderful to me since I arrived here, especially Diane. I always turn up to her office demanding for this and that, and she's always smiling. And she says, yeah, you'll have that. The first thing I asked for was a heater. I wasn't warm enough. I come from the equator, and she said, you will have a heating. So thank you for that. And thank you, Tyler, for looking after this. Now, I would like to talk about this novel first, but I'm mostly going to focus on the processes of writing. It's such a huge, unveiled novel that I haven't really worked out how to talk about it. I'd rather talk about the processes. In terms of the story, I will read a synopsis and then we'll get together and get into it. But as a novel, this book has been knocking around in my head since 2001. Can you believe that? You see, for me, writing is not, the actual typing and writing. Writing starts in the head. So I'm aware that I'm going to write this book, but it hasn't fully formed. So around 2001 to 2015, there were actually supposed to be 2 books. One was about an Africa that is developed. And I know that Africa will arrive, but I won't be here. And I have better write my opinion now so that people will take it into consideration later. But I also wanted to write a novel about the descendants of Africans who were sold into slavery, returning to Africa. That was a very personal thing and so many other reasons. But along the way, probably around 2015, I realized that it was a single book. Now, don't ask me how it happened or when it happened. I just realized it was a single book. And the minute I saw that, I decided to get a notebook, write down the title, which was Al Kebulan already, and then write down everything that had been knocking around in my head, and I put it down. So every time an idea happened, I would go back and put it in that notebook. But at the time, I was writing the collection of short stories. So the short stories, I submitted it, got published. Then A Girl is a Body of Water got published. And then as soon as I submitted it, and in 2019, I started writing this book. But in the beginning, I just put down a skeleton, bones. And then I went back to do other things because then the mind is empty. Then I leave the mind to do it, whatever it does to create things. And then I went and worked on something else. Came back to it 2020, but then COVID hit and I got sick and I couldn't read or write after that. So for 2021, I was just staring in space like that. And then 2022, I got it back. I went back and started to put on the flesh, on the bones. 2023, I started to chisel it into shape, that takes a long time. And 2025, I started to put on the varnish and vinyl. I hope to complete it by the end. I'm supposed to finish it by the end of May when I leave this place, but my goodness, it keeps on shifting and shifting. So now I think June or July will be right. About the research, this book is set in 7 regions. it's so ambitious, even by my standards. Sometimes I think, what was I thinking when I started it? So it's set in 7 regions of the world, and it's everywhere that that slaves were taken to, that I'm looking for communities over there. So I have a character from each of those communities, and I've traveled to each of these countries. So I had to resign my job because I couldn't do this traveling and then teach and then write. So I've traveled to Uganda, I've traveled to South Africa, to Oman, to Sri Lanka, to Uruguay, fancy Uruguay, to the Netherlands, to the US, to Trinidad and Tobago, and I'm supposed to go to Canada, but I'm absolutely broke. I've run out of money. So Canada, I'm praying that they won't see the mistakes in the book. But I also had to give up. I had to apply for British citizenship. For a very long time, I took pride in remaining Ugandan, even though I had lived in Britain for over 20 years. And I identified myself as a Ugandan author. But then the British, Brexit happened. And then the British were like, okay, if you have indefinite leave to remain, you must not be outside this country for more than 9 months in 2 years. And they count the days every time you leave. So I decided to apply for a passport because I knew I was going to travel so much and I was going to spend some time in some places. And surprisingly, the British were really, really wonderful about it. I couldn't believe it. Because at the time I was already in Berlin, and if I stayed longer, I was not coming back to Britain. But I wrote to them, told them the truth, and I think they realized, okay, she's been here for over 20 years, and she's published these books. She doesn't want our passport. Let's give it to her. So they sent it to Berlin, and I'm so thankful for that. And that has allowed me to go to places. But then I couldn't go to Iran to do my research with a British passport, because everybody would say, ooh, do not. But then Iranians were saying, no, go. They won't touch you. But I thought, if I get arrested, the Ugandans would be like, ha, just look her up. And the British would be like, yes, but she has 2 passports, So instead I went to Oman and shifted my character, made him travel from Iran to Oman. So traveling to these places, it didn't matter how long I spent there. I could not understand the culture. I could not get into it. But what I was looking for were the senses. If I could feel, if I could touch, if I could taste, if I could smell, and if I could hear, then I would come back with those, because those are the tiny things that glue a story together, So, but there were parts where I traveled in the book, changed a lot, but often it didn't change very much. But I picked up places, especially places. So my characters grew up on a street and have, give the readers from those places something to bite into. Now, there are so many reasons why I've written this book. But I'm going to talk about one which is very easy to talk about. And that is this idea of global blackness. I think now with the internet and the fact that Africa has started to get into conversation with itself, I think we need to start to be aware of other blacknesses. So in Africa, everyone is aware of African Americans. Everybody identifies with African Americans. We're aware of their journey from the Western coast through slavery, their painful fight for freedom and all of that. And there's also this African American exceptionalism. So we know all about that. We know about the Caribbean, their creativity. There's a lot of cross-pollination in terms of music between the Caribbean and Africa. In fact, when I was young, the first music I was introduced to was calypso. My parents loved calypso. It's a very Ugandan thing. But we thought we knew about South America until the World Cup went there and we saw Brazil and we said, what? So they are like that as well. There are other European countries that got involved in slavery, but because of languages, these European languages, we are not so much aware of them. All the slaves that were taken from East Africa took the Indian Ocean route, and they went to the Middle East and to South Asia. Nothing. We've studied slave trade in Uganda, but we take it up to Malindi, Mombasa, Zanzibar, but we don't know. And the door, that square rectangle boat. We studied all of that, but that is all. And they disappear into the darkness, and we don't know what happened there. So I just wanted to start to bring all these global blacknesses and say, hang on a minute. There are these people. Have you heard about them? Do you know what is happening to them? And also, can we bring them into visibility? But can we have a discussion with them? Can they write themselves and let us know what is going on? This is me having a conversation with Africa. So I'm going to stop there in terms of introducing the book. And I'd like you to join me in the reading. First, I'm going to do the synopsis. I hope you've got a copy. I don't trust my pronunciation. Once I get settled into it, Luganda will interrupt and you better be following it. So I'm going to read the synopsis first. Okay. Al Kebulan, when the lions returned. The global north is declining. China is buckling under the weight of its colossal ambition, and India's promise to become a superpower is yet to arrive. Filling the void is the AF, the African Federation, which is on the cusp of becoming a global power due to its enormous market and the decline of the world around it. The AF comprises of 7 unions: Africa proper, the Caribbean African Union, North American African Union, the South American, South Asia, the Middle Eastern, and the European African Unions. Members of the unions have the right to return, to an African passport, and to vote. Indeed, a lot of them are settling on the continent where they are known as returnees, while the locals are continentals. Colonial borders on the continent have faded, making cities more visible. And because major infrastructures like schools, hospitals, housing, and recreational facilities are concentrated in particular regions, there is internal migration on the continent as well. Unlike the first wave return to Liberia and Sierra Leone soon after abolition, the second wave is a silent return. This has allowed returnees to take charge of the continent and to mold it according to their dreams of the motherland without friction with continentals. Against this background is the Kachiko, a secret agency of returnees, one of 4 overseeing committees puppeteering African politics and development. The Kachiko is made up of 7 members, 1 from each union. Its leader, a rooftop, is a foul-mouthed African-American who calls himself Al Conde. The Kachiko is tasked to move the continent from Africa with all its negative connotations of inadequacy to Al Kebulan, a continent determined by Africans. This task is a 3-pronged mission: environmental, developmental, and political. However, secret services around the world, especially those from declining worlds, are not giving up old Africa, which they had sabotaged for exploitation for decades without a fight. They describe the Kachiko as a cabal, racist, and immoral. Therefore, the AF, which denies existence of a Kachiko or any overseeing committees, does not fund their activities. Unfortunately, the Kachiko is running out of funds to run its operations. It has exhausted the Good Samaritan funding it has been receiving from the unions, cartels and other criminal organizations that used to launder money across Africa keep clear of the continent in fear of confiscation and extortion. Right now, the Kachiko's hope is Professor Kadu Sengo, a secret billionaire who is worth 200 billion African kwacha. Using Kadu's money, the Kachiko hopes to create an endowment as the core source of funds for its future work. However, Kadu is not a criminal. They can't extort him. Although he's Ugandan and black, Kadu looks white, which makes him part of the white minority. The white world, which has accused the AF of racism towards white people, is watching. The Kachiko puts together a plan called Project Legacy. Through blackmail and intimidation of his lawyers and bankers, they invest Kadu's money, which quickly grows due to inside trading. To harvest the dividends from his accounts, the Kachiko lures Kadu back to Uganda from Britain with a cushy job at Howard University of East Africa. When he arrives, they set upon grooming him. However, because of cirrhosis, Al Konde, the leader of the Kachiko, has less than 5 years to live. Yet, Al cannot afford to die before Project Legacy is concluded. At the same time, beneath the benign professorial look, Kadu Sengo can be ruthless, vindictive, and unpredictable. So that's the background of the story. So let's see the story from the Kachiko's point of view. And we're going to find them in Kampala City. This is in the Ugandan region. Al Konde entered the boardroom last. The outer door, built to withstand any blast, closed without a sound. The inner one, a jeep door, disappeared and became the wall. Al felt a chill and looked around the sanctum. It was vast, octagonal, with the peaked ceiling overhead. The weight of the Kachiko's mission hung heavy in the silence. Al acknowledged it with an imperceptible nod. Now he walked to his seat and stood behind his chair. Being rooftop, 2 spears were planted into the floor on either side of Al's seat. On the left was a hunting spear made from stainless steel. On the right, a warrior spear made from iron. They rose above him when he sat down. Every member was stationed behind the seats, Al pulled back his chair. The lights went out. Everyone remained still as sensors swept across the room with laser beams. When the checks were done, the members turned and faced the wall behind Al. Part of it had turned into a giant screen. Al Kebulan's national anthem, Ingi Mungu Ibariki Al Kebulan, started, and while it ran, the words, "The dream realized," lit up high on the screen. Below, the Pan-African flag filled the screen for a few seconds and then rose. A text from Africa to Al Kebulan came on just before the new nation's emblem of the mythical Siamese crocodiles that shared a stomach started to rise. Then Al Kebulan's motto, unity in diversity. As that image disappeared, the 4 parents of Pan-Africa started to rise. First, the women, Alice V. Kenlock, then Jean and Paulette Nadal. Now came the others, rolling like film credits. Horton, Delaney, Cromo, Blyden, Dubois, Hayfield, Sylvester Williams, Garvey, Cabral, Louverture, James, Desalegn, Padmo, Senghor, Cesare, Kenyatta, Cullen, Lumumba, Nyerere, Hughes, Mackay, Selassie, Robson, Nkrumah, Marley, Diop, Asante, Sobukwe, Woodson. As Kalinga, the last name, came on, the female member mouthed, and all the women missing on that list. Al cursed the list under his breath. Given power, he would remove it altogether. It was impossible to please everyone. Recently, calls to include Muammar Gaddafi had been stepped up in New Timbuktu, the capital, and discreet consultations in the regions of Libya had begun. The national anthem ended. Then the warning, beware, the declining world will do its worst in its final days, flashed for a few seconds and died. Now the aims of the Kachiko flashed. As they rolled, the agents recited along. To move the motherland from Africa, a place of pain and humiliation, to Al Kebulan, a place that we, children of this continent, have chosen for ourselves. To protect the motherlands from forces, external and internal, of wanton aggression, exploitation, manipulation, and humiliation. To restore the motherland to its natural splendor before Western colonization. To return all its natural wonders to their indigenous names. The screen died and the lights came back on. The Kachiko took their seats. Besides Al Conde, there were 5 men and a woman sitting around a racetrack boardroom table with a gap in the middle. From the gap, a 4-faced clock rose counting time. On either side of the table sat 3 members spaced out. Every member, including the woman, wore a kanzu, the long white Ganda robe for men. On top, they draped a back cloth knotted over the left shoulder like a toga. On their heads were large white turbans wrapped in the elaborate Malian style to indicate where they were trained. One member, though, Kaz, wore a fez instead of a turban. Kaz was not an agent and led no team. He did not attend sessions to do with the agent work. When he attended any sessions, all he did was listen. However, because Kaz owned ACC, Alkebulan Cable Corporation, he was the media guru for the Kachiko. On the table in front of Al sat a small traditional basket and a small gourd. When the clock struck 20 hours, he took the basket, which held a handful of smoked coffee beans, picked one, put it in his mouth, and passed on the basket. And as he passed on the basket, he chewed. He took the gourd with unrefined tonto, a banana brew, took a sip, and passed it on as well. He watched as each member chewed on a coffee bean and sipped on the brew. There was purpose to this ritual, to these rituals, to settle and focus the mind, to reinforce purpose, to bolster resolve, but most of all, to strengthen kinghood. When the basket and the gourd returned, Al started. It's going to be a long meeting. There are a few items on the agenda beside your report. First, Kadu Sengo is on his way to Kampala. So that's the story from the Kachiko's point of view. So now, let's look at the story from Kadu's point of view. And we're going to meet him in Kisangani, which is in the Democratic Republic of Congo region. The Cape to Cape Hyperloop train burst out of the tube and bounced into the open. Kadu's pod hissed as it slowed down to a crawl. The shutters went up and natural light flooded to the pod. Everyone looked up. In the distance was Kisangani, the terminal. The cityscape was supposed to be a welcome sight. Kisangani was only 18 minutes away from home, but a vague apprehension sat in Kadu's chest. He undid his seatbelt and stretched. Kadu's future was in Kampala and he could not wait to get there. But his mind kept cautioning. This is Africa, Kadu. It can be deceptive. He blamed this pessimism on the morning he set off from Britain. He had returned from a pub at 3 a.m., but instead of going to sleep, he had cowed into a corner and bawled his eyes out. Why? He had no idea. Since then, his heart has coughed. Tears before starting a new life? Bad luck. As the pod approached, the words Patrice Lumumba Central Station loomed large and neon on the roof of the structure. So much for erasure, Kadu thought. Neither the American grave robbers nor the Belgian ghouls who dug Lumumba's body up to dissolve it in acid took into consideration the elephantine nature of African memory. No African hero, not even Mandela, had been reborn in children across the continent the way Patrice Lumumba had. Without international megaphones to voice their anger, for generations, Africans had reincarnated their hero in their sons. By the time the pod pulled onto the platform, Kadu was at the door. As soon as it sprang open, he ran up 2 flights onto the ground floor, hurried across the foyer, and joined the queue outside Tam Tam Barbecue. He had saved his appetite for a portion of their fabled goat nyamachoma, piri-piri gravy, collard greens known as sukuma and chapati. He also ordered fontangawizi chai a latte with raw milk. For Kadu, that straight from the udder taste and aroma was welcome home. He found a seat next to the barrier that overlooked the northern quarters, sat down and unwrapped his delight. First, he spread out the chapati. Then he shredded the pieces of meat which he spread on the chapati bed. He sprinkled some gravy on top. Then he layered the meat with the sukuma wiki and scooped more gravy to layer on thick. This was the ultimate African travel experience. 5 days earlier, when he had set off from Britain, Kadu had embarked on the Dream Safari, the ATC African Transcontinental Crossing. Thanks to the Cape to Cape Express, he had breakfasted in Cape Angela, the farthest tip in the north of Africa, lunched in Kisangani, Central Africa, and suppered in Cape Agalas, the farthest town in the south of Africa. As he rolled the chapati, Kat looked out at the city. He took in the mimetic and biomorphic architecture, the 100% clean energy, the neatness, and sucked his teeth. Kisangani was a waste of dreams. Back in the day, when Africa was still dreaming of development, the idea was that there would be no aping aesthetics of New York, London, Beijing, Singapore, not to mention Dubai, on the continent. Africa would come up with a new city aesthetic. But those dreams had been dashed. It was as if mayors from the continent had gone to the declining world, grabbed their city blueprints, and returned to reproduce them on the continent. Not even the vertical gardens would soften Kisangani's mimicry. Kadu bit into the raw, and when his tongue rolled it around, his taste buds were set so alight, his eyes dilated. He shook his head as if to resettle the senses. He dipped the raw into the gravy, and when he bit again, he was so lost he slurped. He lifted the chai, blew away the skin that had formed on top, and attempted at a sip. His head snapped back. His tongue scolded like a warning. He put the cup down and looked out at Kisangani again. The problem with this city, Kadu decided, were the working classes. They had fled it. Without the mayhem of hawkers and hustlers, open-store grocers and butchers, idlers and roadside chefs, the noise of hagglers, the color of fruit and vegetables, the smell of food on open stoves, and the sheer disorder, Kisangani had no soul. Every time Kadu visited, he noticed that the personalities of old cities, Lagos's, you talk, I don't care, Kampala's sense of going somewhere, Kishasha's, don't worry, be happy, Nairobi's, maybe not, and Accra's attempts at being the sensible older siblings were disappearing. As soon as Kisangani had scrubbed up, rich returnees had moved in and working classes had moved out, ostensibly because Kisangani was too sterile for life. No more room to maneuver anymore. They sucked their teeth as they packed their bags. Now we meet Kadu on the train to Uganda. Kadu looked outside the window. The train had picked up such speed that it was impossible to see objects. A sadness descended on him. The Africa that brought him up was vanishing as fast. Yet this was what Africans had strived for, development at any cost. Perhaps the dizzying speed at which the continent was transforming was the real reason Kadu resented Kisangani. The world had always looked at Black Africa as a country. In return, Black Africa had created a relationship with itself that no other continent had, a sense of us Africans against the contemptuous world. It had united the continent in the struggle to get there. Now that development was here, something was amiss. Africa had lost that special relationship with itself. That unity of we are in this together was vanishing. To lose a destination, Kadu realized, was to lose a dream. No doubt most Africans did not meet the pass. Many had not got there yet. It was rich bastards like him that entertained notions of a heroic and innocent African past disappearing. But for a warrior like Kadu sitting on that train that evening, it felt as if an out-of-control force was propelling the continent's rise. Of course, that force were the returning diaspora. And yet, returnees were invisible. There was not a single returnee in politics, not a notable entrepreneur or billionaire strutting their stuff across the continent. There had been nothing as momentous as the Industrial Revolution. Africa had not colonized or enslaved anyone to plunder labor and resources. All that had happened was the union of African countries to form a single market, the return of the diaspora, and the annexation of African unions from around the world. Africa had astonished itself and the world. Developed nations woke up too late to the fact that the black dinar, the black dollar, the black pound, and the black euro were not ideas conjured by deluded Pan-Africanists, but facts. For a while, black capital had hemorrhaged from the north and from the east and poured into Africa to invest in industry, process minerals and raw materials, to invest in education, in housing, and in health sectors. Kadu would come home, find a new hospital, a housing estate, a factory being built, and someone would remark, "Oh, it's that footballer." Or, "It's an Afro-Arab from the Middle East. He lives in Kisangani." But he never saw or read about them. The world, always dismissive of Africa, realized too late to stem the flow. At the time, Africans around the world seemed to breathe in rhythm like termites. The financial flight towards Africa felt inexorable like revenge. Gagged by political correctness, Western global watchers had grappled to find the right words to explain the moment. Afrocentric economists claimed that this financial flight was the world finally turning right. Continental Africans claimed, "We saw it coming." To them, the idea of diasporas asking their countries for rights had become untenable. The very act of asking, the act of being given equality, perpetuated power dynamics that were no longer acceptable. Dynamics that gave rise to giving some rights now and withholding some for later. In the absence of a convincing explanation for the meteoric rise of Africa, numerous conspiracy theories had filled the void. A Eurocentric one claimed that while blacks fought for equality in these countries, an African cult dark with viges had plotted and planned to undermine the very worlds blacks lived in. Apparently, the hemorrhage of black capital had been orchestrated by this cabal. For Kadu, the notion of a nefarious cult which had unleashed revenge on the pale-skinned world was laughable. Much of the diaspora returning carried the fair-skinned world in itself, in family and culture. Another theory claimed that Africa's development was a rogue wave. It came out of nowhere and it overwhelmed the world. And like rogue waves, there was no satisfactory explanation yet. It will not last, the experts claimed. Africa lacks the skill to sustain it. Meanwhile, opportunistic evangelists had proclaimed Black Exodus and Black Israel from their pulpits. Others thumped their Bibles, Babylon the Great has fallen, and wagged warning fingers, flee Babylon, run for your lives. But then again, Kadu thought, what do you expect from pedantic preachers desperate to remain relevant to the moment? Then there was the curse of the continent, a chilling belief born and nursed on the continent, then passed down through the generations. The curse of the continent had prophesied that Africa will never find peace until all the children it sold into slavery returned. According to continentals, Africa's former instability, migration of talent and skill, stunted growth, being bullied, humiliated, and exploited by older nations, was the continent drowning in the tears of those it sold. For centuries, the curse had haunted the continent without relief, without hope. After all, why would they return to the shithole? Now, it seemed, the curse was breaking. But the most bruising fury came from the diaspora, the fiery anti-federation, anti-union, anti-return blacks from around the world. They were not only contemptuous, they were spiteful. You did not call them African. We severed connection with that continent a long time ago. We have nothing in common with Africans. To them, Africa, lazy and corrupt, had been freeloading on developed nations. Now that the first world had exhausted itself with invention and innovation, Africa had arrived to harvest the fruits of their labors. Fair enough, Kadu shrugged. The West had been a social, political, and cultural experiment. Incredible good had come out of it, and the First World had enjoyed the privileges of being a vanguard, an innovator. Unfortunately, not every experiment was positive. Africa, being far behind, took what the First World did right and made it its own. The disasters it kept well clear of. But what kept Kadu awake at night about this meteoric rise of Africa was that it could turn the continent into the new USA, the bully, the lion on the Serengeti. Someone somewhere was going to be eaten. Once in place, phenomena like this self-perpetuated. Already, the Kwacha was engorged, fueled by people scrambling to insert themselves into the New World Order. The AF's naked ambition for de-dollarization, to make the African Kwacha the world reserve currency, was almost vengeful. Things would sort themselves out, Kadu thought. After all, economies in the global north were now geriatric. In fact, the financial flight was the diaspora sensing the onset of Alzheimer's in their countries, cutting their losses and running for youthful economies. Kadu shook himself out of the melancholy. This moment, his homeward bound was happiness. He had been headhunted by Howard University of East Africa. He was returning to an Africa, positioning itself as the center of Afrocentric thought, energy, and capital. Trust his hyper-vigilant mind to find fault with development, when all around him was a sense of, he at last, thank God, development at last. So, this further story has been told through a third-person narrator, but from particular points of view. Now the narrator switches in this part into the sunshine. Now, let's pause for a moment. Let's pause for a minute. So far, I've been a discreet and intrusive voice relating the events of this moment at a distance. But now, I take my place in the sunshine. I refuse to be the detached, nameless, faceless, third-person narrator that happily stays outside the action in the name of objectivity. For centuries, we omniscients have stood at a distance to render stories objective. And yet, our seeing, our digesting, and our distilling of what we observe, crafting it into a cohesive tale, makes this noble occupation possible. Our talent delivers the delightful blend of beauty and agony, joy and pain, awe and anxiety within a safe environment to transport you through place and time. We've been so good at it that we've disappeared into the background, which is wonderful most of the time. Perhaps you've worked it out already. Omniscients are ghosts and spirits of the departed, often former griots from your worlds. This is why in the wonderful past, before we storytellers began to weave our tales, we offered libation to the ancestors. It was their voices we were borrowing. It was their imagination we were helping ourselves to, and we were grateful. However, you are a grasping generation living in grudging times. We can't make demands. A multitude of us, spirits of Africans dragged to all corners of the earth as slaves, and many of our loved ones left behind, did not cross over when we transitioned to immortality. We are still hovering the earth. Some are watching and waiting. Some are seeking, hoping to find loved ones. Some have other reasons, often dark. Unlike spirits that stayed in hovering to find loved ones, I stayed to find release. In our time, death was a gift. Slaves could not wait to unshackle themselves from the body. It was the body that the slaver bought. It was the body that got us bound. Thus to die and then stay in consciousness and watch your people still trapped in the body suffer, especially progeny, seem to perpetuate your own torment. But those were beliefs held by slaves who thought that the chains were only physical. For some of us, the soul was in chains as well. And there's no pain like a chained soul. We so craved vindication, the validation of our humanity, the ownership of our bodies, and the possibility of our dreams coming true that we had no option but to stay in consciousness. And it's been worth it. I've walked with my people every moment of achievement. I've suffered every misstep. I've known the anguish of their despair. I've celebrated every inch of freedom clawed from the grasping hands of fright. I even got to see the good in the other side. As a slave, I never knew that many of them were against slavery. Behold, here we are. Because of the extensive knowledge I've acquired since coming into immortality, I'm often called upon to take on omniscient duties. But through the centuries of doing this work, I've not met a moment like this. This moment is not just a reclamation of home. It is a culmination of centuries-old labor. This is our blood returning home. Do you understand what that means to us Africans who knew both worlds? It is so monumental, yet so intimate that we each clutch it in phantom chest to feel. For us spirits and ghosts of bodies that lived that marrow-deep slavery or its undiluted after effects soon after abolition, this moment of return to the motherland goes beyond dreams. This is when you, our descendants, move beyond crying foul. Crying in any form, even for your rights, carries the pungent stench of victimhood. There's power in perpetrating. Horrible, horrendous power, but power nonetheless. How then can I tell this story detached and at a distance? And for why? So that you, the wonderfully free people, can have objectivity? I know you don't want to hear this, but compared to us Africans who arrived as slaves straight off the ship, the dough, the guinea man, the imba cacao, you contemporaries are wonderfully free. And we are happy it happened. But we were never citizens of the worlds that enslaved us the way you are. We could not and did not belong. I therefore refuse to stand on the sidelines and narrate this story with the objective indifference of an omniscient narrator for your comfort. What these boys and girls on the Kachiko and other overseeing committees have done so far, what they're doing and what they'll do in future, they do for all of us. From the first man, woman and child caught, abducted, sold and sailed outside this continent, to the last child born out there into the wild world of exile, for those who will embrace it and those who will reject it. This return, they do it for all of us. This is so that those who are alive and those who will be born later may not carry the burden we carried. A triumphant return means to look in the eyes of the descendants of those who sold us and say, behold, we not only survived, we thrived. Now we return to restore the motherland you've squandered. Be careful, we are lions. A triumphant return means to fart in the faces of the descendants of those who enslaved us and say, you can take your go back where you come from, stick it in your pipe and smoke it. Most of all, a triumphant return is for us weary spirits that have been waiting for this moment to finally go into oblivion, knowing that restoration will be achieved. How then am I expected to remain detached and objective? This Africa that has centered itself, its action, thought, orientation, production, and consumption. This Africa that sits down and holds conversation with itself. This Africa that has stopped worrying about what the world thinks. This Africa that is driving itself towards a destination of its own choosing has been in our dreams for centuries. Only the gods know how long we've been waiting for this continent to realize that it is not about the world, but about itself. That it is much more than a continent and its diaspora. That Africa is a world in of itself. That all this abuse and humiliation it has endured is because this continent is critical to the world. Here's a funny thing. When the world realized that Africa was coming into its own, the question became who and how Africa sees. And that, my friend, is power. To see or not to see, and render some worlds invisible the way Africa was rendered invisible for a long time, is the question. Don't worry, I'll still tell the story omnisciently. However, because these boys and girls on the Kachiko live in deception and thrive on fiction, and because Africa is a vast, vast world, once in a while, I'll draw close to your ear and whisper. Thank you. Thank you.
Wow, that was amazing, Jennifer. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I'm thinking here, both as an African, as a literary scholar, I'm like, wow, I won't look at Omniscient's narration the same way after this. Yeah, thank you. There's really so much to think with here, so I want to open the floor to you, distinguished members of our audience, to pose questions and comments to Jennifer. We have 2 microphones on either side, and yeah, just raise your hand, and then the mic will come to you. Okay, we'll take you, and then I'll take you second.
Hello, I'm Nancy Ruther. I used to be associated with the Macmillan Center in African Studies. And early on, one of the first things that struck me, I did work mostly in Latin America, but you talked about the returnees, and
Yes.
continentals. Portugal did the same thing in reverse. When the retornados, who were the Portuguese working in Angola, Mozambique, came back to Portugal.
Oh, yeah.
Were they citizens or returnees? And a lot of what you describe here, I saw when I did some work in Portugal. So it just really struck me. It's real. And that the citizens, the old citizens, would want to ignore them because they were the force for change. It seems spot on to me. from a real world example.
It's interesting. One, I wasn't aware of the Portuguese returning to, but there's a difference between this relationship. The Portuguese came to Africa as conquerors, as you can imagine, and the Africans came to this world as slaves. So for Africans returning to Africa, they're coming back to a continent that is racked by guilt, up to a certain extent. In my book, I'm not talking about the real continent. I'm talking about my book. They're coming back to a continent racked with guilt. And therefore, and they've been courted to come back. So the relationship is not going to be the same as the Portuguese relating to fellow Portuguese who've been in Africa for a very long time. And so, but also we've had an earlier wave of return, and that was very difficult because this was soon after abolishment, and the Africans that returned came back with a very American attitude, and they didn't fit in, but Africans also thought, okay, we've got colonizers, but we're also getting people who look like us, behaving like colonizers. So there was that friction. And because of that awareness, the returnees are not making that mistake. So you see, Al Conde, the leader of the Kachiko, has a Ugandan name. He calls himself Ugandan. All the members of the Kachiko, they are all returnees, but they use Ugandan names. They speak the language, but they are doing other things.
Let's take one here, real quick. Yeah, one here and then.
Thank you so much for gracing us with that reading, Dr. Makumbi. Thank you for your time and your energy. I've had the immense privilege of reading Kintu and A Girl is a Body of Water, and I'm in the middle of reading Manchester Happened. And just in tracking the themes and what your main characters seem to be involved with and confronting, I'm in awe of your ambition in having this 7-region Pan-African novel.
It's just crazy.
No, I think it's phenomenal, you know? I think crazy can be good sometimes. And so thinking of the fact that, yes, there are all these African descendants in places like Palestine, like Fiji, like Brazil, I'm just really curious. And I see like hints of the feminism already with the female member just whispering under her breath about Kalenga.
Could
Like,
help myself.
right. Oh, thank you, please. I'm just wondering, what do you think is going to be the central conflict here? I can track several already, like the eternal one that started with like Coming to America with Eddie Murphy, just, Africans and African Americans.
Yes.
And just hearing more recently about, Afro-Latine folk and Afro-Asians. And just even you now specifying, yeah, they all have these Ugandan names, but they're returnees. And then thinking of Ghana's Right to Return that they hosted in 2019 and how monumental that was. And all these celebrities went there and were reincarnated or renamed. I'm just wondering, especially this, like with this introduction of the Omniscient, so much is happening. What do you think is your central conflict you're going to focus on thus far? I know you said you want to focus on the process and not the actual book itself, but can you let us know what the central conflict is for you and if and how feminism can or will feature as it has in your first 2 books?
Okay, yeah, thank you. That is quite elaborate. The major conflict is I'm staying away from feminism because I whenever I lift my head in Uganda, everybody a feminist. So, and you know what? My books often talk about masculinities and very, very nicely, but people don't appreciate. But at the moment, I am focused on how Africa negotiates the powers around it. So I refused to focus on how the West is declining. I'm not looking at it. Everything is happening in Africa. And you only see that all the attacks from outside trying to sabotage Africa, because that is the laying golden eggs, the where their meal is. But it's mainly the Kachiko trying to get this nation, the new nation that is Africa, United Africa, from where it is to where they call Al Kebulan, the place where they're going, where it's a single nation, it's powerful, and all these dictators are going and whatever. But in the process of doing that, there's a lot of sabotage going on. And so it's getting the money to run these clandestine operations, and getting this money from a white-looking man who is also a Muganda. So that is what I'm focused on. And because I just couldn't. It is so big. I had to have, in the beginning, have a big introduction, but then zoom into a single conflict. There are others, I can't help talking about Buganda Kingdom and our problems, but otherwise it's focused on that and how then they get their money off Kadu. Yeah, that is the major conflict.
Hi, Jennifer. It's lovely to see you in this particular setting. And you've influenced a lot of things that I've done, and I'm incredibly grateful for that. And it's also exciting to see this book come to life. I'm particularly excited about the fact that it's in a region that's familiar to the both of us so far, what you've read so far. That's not what we tend to see when writing about returning to the continent. So you're really dealing with something that's going to be quite novel, at least for a lot of us that sort of grew up on the continent, etc. I was thinking about this notion of the waves of returning. You've talked about, you've read and written about this sort of first wave, and you're talking about this other wave, but there's also like a current phase as you write. And I wondered how you deal with that especially in the region that you're also talking about, so that, there's the return in Ghana, etc. But there's also a really interesting process of returning, and particularly African Americans and people from other regions, to that area that you're writing about at the moment. Exactly.
You know what? I thought, when I told you that this book has been knocking around in my head in 2001, I was so excited. I was doing something novel, something new. I'm going to, surprise everybody. And come 2022, I start to hear stuff, I'm talking about the unification of Africa. And East Africa comes up with an African passport. And then now they're talking about an East African passport. Now the whole of Africa is talking about an African passport. And we're like, no, these are my ideas. First of all, I swear to you, I didn't know what was. And sometimes I think maybe this is what Carl Jung was talking about when he went on about synchronicity, because I don't know when it happened. All the ideas I have here, I swear to you, were original, but have been overtaken by events. Now I'm running against time, because you never know what else Africans are going to come up with. So now I see these people coming back to Africa, and they even have YouTube channels, and I'm listening, and I'm like, now everybody's going to think this is where I stole the ideas. No, you know. So I've been telling my agent we need to get this book out before, everything is like, oh, that happened yesterday. Oh, nothing exciting. And for me, writing novels, and this I learned from doing my PhD, because we were told you need to bring something new on the table. A PhD is not worth it if you're just going to regurgitate what everybody has been talking about. So I was like, okay, let me knock these people out. Not anymore.
Thank you. Hi, Dr. Makumbi. I have more of a comment than a question. I just wanted to say how much I appreciate your integration of our ancestral knowledge and spirit into your works. I know from reading A Girl is a Body of Water, which I brought with me today, when you were talking about Shilabo's hesitancy to connect with her spiritual self, the travels in her dreams, and how her aunt, I believe, recognized that as the gift, like gifts that the first women had.
Yes.
And into just like the name Al Kebulan, knowing that that's the indigenous name of Africa, as well as bringing spirit and the, sorry, I'm a bit shaky, but talking about spirit in the synopsis that you read for us, kind of showcasing how ancestors and spirits are always around us, regardless of how colonization further keeps pushing it away from us,
yes.
demonizing it through Abrahamic religions.
Yes.
And you do it so slightly and so just so efficiently, and your connection with historical events through fiction. I believe fiction is really nonfiction. I know when I was reading A Girl is a Body of Water, at one part, there was a song you wrote, and I read it to my dad, and he was like, I haven't heard that song since I was a kid. So I really just love the way you integrate the past, present, future, ancestral, and spiritness. And I'm excited to learn more about Kadu, because I feel like I resonate with him.
Yeah.
And I think his side is very important to the story of the future of Africa. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for saying that. Thank you for reading that song to your father. I know. The thing about traditional beliefs and everything, to me, I write them as just part of life. It's people call it magical realism. I don't know. This is just reality. Or sometimes we call it spiritual reality. You grow up with people talking like that, and how can I write Africa without writing that? And it's not. I write it the way I write the sun. Because in Uganda, the sun is going to rise every day, whatever you do. And therefore, you're going to have these spiritual beliefs. But it's only out here that we talk about them that way. Otherwise, they're just part of life. So often, I don't look at my books as having magical realism or whatever. This is just spiritual realism to me.
What are questions? So we'll go to Bile and then I'll come to you, Kemi.
Thank you. Good evening, Dr. Makumbi. It is such an honor, let me actually stand up, to be in your presence for the first time. Like, it's always just been an extremely wonderful experience to read your work. I also come in I sort of present this question similarly to Cajetan as a literature scholar, because I can't help it. I wonder about your sort of movement between the first and the third person narration. Yes. And not for you to be prescriptive, but what are the italics doing for you? Because I think already that's complicating the oscillation between the first and the third person narration as definitive. So I'm curious to hear what you have to say about that.
Italicizing. Okay. Because if this book gets published, you'll see the scope of it. It's really big. And the italicization is just a shift from Kadu's point of view, a shift into the Kachiko's point of view, and a shift into the narrator. So the narrator keeps returning. So you have Al Conde, who is African American. So the narrator returns and says, so he has called himself this and that. Actually, this and this. So he gives you that background information from where he came from. Okay? But he gives it to you in the first person and also often in the present tense. The way we talk. So very close to your ear, and there's no formality to it. So the shift is, the italicization is about the shift. I also do italicization when the story is told from Kadu's point of view and his thinking. I do that. But it's not about what we used to do in terms of Luganda words in English, and I highlight the... No, it's nothing like that. It's just the shift. Though one of my editors, personal editor, kept on saying, do not insist that this is a whisper. I just want to shift, and I know, yes, now my ancestor is talking to me. And that was my editor. But a group of people, authors, published authors I write with, I've given them the pieces, and they're like, no. Leave the whispers the way they are. Most of them are non-African. So I'm thinking that I hope this book will be read by other diasporas rather than Africa. So for the first time, I'm thinking my African readers trust me. But can I accommodate the new reader from the diaspora? So this is why. So there's a lot of compromise in this book because of it. So go gent on me.
Hi, Dr. Makumbi. My name is Kemi. I am from Uganda. I'm one of the little girls that have been so inspired by, I guess not little, but yeah, that have been inspired by your work. Thank you for being here with us today. Going back more to like the process, yes. I think I can really resonate, and a lot of my work like that I'm doing at school here is like going to this theme of like global blackness. Yes. And some of the, I'm curious as to like I've been inspired by your commitment to doing the research and going out and like sort of seeking out these communities. And I'm inspired, I guess I'm curious to know like how you were received sometimes in the places that were not traditionally, I mean, like when you say Sri Lanka or like some of these places where you're not thinking they're Black communities for various other reasons, but if you can sort of speak to that experience during the research, and if those themes will come out in the book.
Okay, thank you. You will be surprised by how I was received in these places. Apart from the US and the Netherlands, those places that we've never heard of, blackness there is running away from itself. It's just unbelievable. So I arrived in Muscat, and I took this gentleman with me. He's my friend's husband. I just borrowed him. I needed a husband in Oman. You don't just show your face, So we walk in, he is in front of me, I'm walking behind him like a dutiful wife. And at the airport, we meet all these men, there were no women, waiting for people. And the shock on their faces when they saw a very pale man with this black, very dark African. Like, how could you waste your whiteness on this woman? I mean, the shock on their faces was unbelievable. Now, I paid for the tickets, I paid for the B&B, I paid for the tickets, I paid for the meal, and they would thank him. I would give them the card, and they would turn and say thank you. He's not here. He loved it. But it just amazed me. So I could, in Oman, and this is the friendliest country in the Middle East to blackness, because, Oman had a relationship with Zanzibar, and there's this rumor that one of the Omani sheikhs leaders was born to a Muganda woman, the mother of Kabaka Mutesa. One time an Arab walked in and she said, but why Arabic men so handsome? And her husband said, go with them, And she was sent away, and indeed, when she arrived in the palace, she had a child. So there's this idea that Omanis, their royal family, has a bit of black in them. And yet, the racism over there was unbelievable. Now, one time, I dressed very African, covered myself, covered with head, and we walked into a mall. Now, over there, pale Iranis are not allowed to sit front-facing, selling whatever. Only black women did that, which I thought, okay, this is wonderful. Let's take it. But we walked in, and we didn't realize, me and my friend, we were chatting, and we seemed very friendly. And of course, they thought we were husband and wife. And believe me, these black women who were selling in the supermarket ran out and started screaming at us and waving and dancing around. It took me a while to realize that they were celebrating the fact that I was attractive to a white-looking man. So when I say this blackness need to be brought into visibility, indeed. When I went to Sri Lanka, we arrived to the black community. They were very happy to see us, and then they had flowers to give. I was in front, and the person giving us flowers walked around me and gave them to the white guy. And a white-looking guy, because it's not white. And it was the same everywhere, except in Trinidad and Tobago. Oh, yeah. They were rude to him. I was like, yeah, I'm home. So, but it was unbelievable. And I think we are late. Because the Kapili, or the Kafris of Sri Lanka are disappearing. They are just marrying into the locals to disappear. So that, and of course I would come back very angry. You won't believe what I've written about Omanis. But yeah.
Okay, we have time for a final question. Yes.
Thank you so much for your talk and for your time reading through this beautifully written script. As I was reading, I was particularly struck by how you're weaving in material culture or material heritage and intangible heritage. And one thing I noticed specifically was this reference to the purpose of rituals. So I'm curious as to whether there are new rituals that are being created and performed in this novel by the Kachiko, or are they just adapting previous rituals that have been performed? So the whole notion of, drinking from the same gourd, or chewing, in this case you said coffee beans, but I think in other parts of Africa it might be kola nut. Yeah, so I'm curious if there are other rituals that we can expect to come out of this book, perhaps that are either adaptations or that are new rituals entirely.
Okay. I've gone specifically for old rituals that I play around and make new. Okay. So the the person sitting with a spear, one spear here and one spear there, I know that, Al, the leader of the Kachiko, is a hunter, and he's also a fighter, So I put those spears there. I don't know whether anyone, maybe the Kabaka, but I've never seen a throne having, those spears. So I am playing around with that. The eating, chewing on the coffee bean and drinking, that is standard in Buganda. But there was one ritual that I was really, really interested in. So from the beginning of our kingdom, you didn't have to be born to Uganda parents to be a Muganda. So because we were expansionists, people would arrive and say, yeah, I am a Muganda. Can't speak a word of it. And all you had to do is have a name, a totem, and a clan. But, people would be eating their clan because you can't eat your totem. And say, well, what is your totem? Ngabi. What are you eating? Ngabi. It's been like that for a very long time. So when the British arrived, and then they brought the Asians, some British people took on, I kid you not, they took on totems, they took on Ugandan names and became Baganda. And there's still families in Uganda, the Barlows, the Bleaks, the whatever, they were former people from Britain, But it's the same with the Asians. They would take on and become. But now the question is, Buganda Kingdom is not Uganda. Uganda is the Republic. So what happens when Buganda Kingdom takes on a non-African, non-Ugandan and says, yeah, you're Uganda. So what happens with the Uganda and Africa? Okay? So first of all, is this still true? Because now we've become so possessive of our cultures and whatever. So Kadu has an African-American mother, okay? But his father is South African. But his parents intentionally insisted that they are going to have him in Uganda. And the African-American mother came back and said, no, they don't have to give me a clan or whatever. I just take what I want. They sold us. So she takes on a clan. But the white husband is in trouble. But still, he took on a name and named himself Sengo. So when this child was born in Uganda, in Buganda, he was totally a Muganda because that is the tradition. So when Kadu returns, his parents are dead and the world is changing. And so he asks, am I Muganda? He speaks the language, he's everything, Muganda. And so he goes to the Kabaka and says, am I Muganda? And so I reenact out that ritual. But it's also to remind my people that, you know what? We were never, ever grasping of our culture. We were open. Somebody, it's still the same, because now people arrive in Uganda and they would say, yeah, but you look South Sudanese. I say, yeah, my mother is South Sudanese, but my dad was from Uganda. He died. Then he gave me this name. And they move on. But which is fantastic in a way of belonging when you look at the West, and the West is grasping at its borders and whatever. And Buganda was like, yeah, you're welcome, come in. But I'm asking, is this still the same?
Wow, a great place to end. Please join me in thanking Dr. Makumbi for this amazing lecture.
Thank you. Thank you very much.